This week I elected, sorry if you have prepared a lesson, prepared to read through Nehemiah, the first 4 chapters, because that was where I was going to go to kind of tie in the theme that we were running through for the past few weeks. But it was a great VBS. The children were amazing, and I thought maybe to give you some, because you maybe didn't sit in the classes and you didn't know what they were dealing with, to touch on that, and so that when you look at this this program they went through, that you will more or less have an idea what they experienced this week. On the first day, it was called the Sunrocks Kids Camp, and the first day they dealt with Jesus Christ, that was an extremely accepting person. He chooses Peter to follow him. And it deals with the most important thing of that I'm loved by Jesus Christ. In other words, all the children, that theme followed of every class. In other words, we dealt with memory verses in the preschool that God loves us and calls us as his children. They did some wonderful crafts as well during that time. The second day they dealt with being protected by Jesus, and it dealt with the central theme of Peter being able to walk on water. And the phenomenal thing that he did was that when he fell forward into the arms of Jesus Christ. And then that idea that speaks of the children must not be afraid, because whatever they do, Christ is with them. And giving them that idea that the God of this universe is walking alongside them. They did wonderful crafts that day. They did Peter's boat in a bottle, walking in the water, on water window, nature's pout, and all those kind of. It was wonderful to see teachers wading through water with their gumboots. It was just incredible to see that. Then the third day they dealt with being saved by Jesus. And the idea speaking about Peter's confession of Christ. And what we try to deal with the children there is to show them that they should show love to Christ and to Jesus, and explain and exclaim that he is the Christ that they love. And the fourth day was dealing with Peter's denial. And Peter's denial was a tough one, but yet also the idea that we will all mess up at some time, but that Christ forgives us and that he loves us with all of his heart, and that he's forgiving and he draws people closer even after they have messed up. And the idea of a fresh start rainbow was one of the crafts of the grade 3 and 4. Flowering tiles, and it's wonderful crafts these children did. And we left the sets as they are and the classrooms as they are, so that you as the parent could have a browse. And these wonderful sets, we left them up so that for one day, today you can experience what your children experienced. And on the fifth day, they spoke about living for Jesus. And the idea there is obviously that Peter helps a lame man, and then saying that I can do all things through Christ, that the child is enabled by God that steps into his life, that says, I'm here for you, I forgive you, but you can also do whatever you want to do. I'm going to have a lesson accompanying this morning's overview. And I'm going to tell you a story out of a novel that was written by C.E. Montague. The novel that he wrote was called Rough Justice. And in one of those stories, you find a scene with a little boy called Bron. Bron went to church with his governess. And he walks into the church for the very first time, and he watches with interest every part of the service. The preacher gets up to deliver a sermon, and he speaks about the terrible things that happened to this brave, innocent man, unsolicited violence that comes against him, where everything that he did in his entire life was just goodness. And he sits there and he feels terribly hurt, because in vivid detail, the preacher explains about the nails that went into his hands, the terrible hurt and the flogging this child went through, and the dreadful pain that even now he feels when we do not do what he intensely desires for us. Little Bron thinks that the preacher is telling a story, and he looks around, and a lot of people are there listening intently, some of them fidgeting, some of them are disinterested, and some of them falling asleep. Some of them getting up, going to the toilet, and he watches this with great interest, because this little Bron looks at this and he says, a terrible injustice was perpetrated, but nobody seems to be too bothered about this. And in this novel, the story goes on, and he says to himself, hang on a minute, somewhere along the line, somebody's going to do something about this to right this injustice. And little Bron begins to cry. And Bron is very, very upset because he really feels for this innocent man they call Jesus. And he's puzzled by the almost distancedness by the folk that claims to love this Jesus. And then when the service is over, everybody just gets up, walks away, greets their mates, and walks out of the building after hearing such terrible news. But all the way through, he says that, hang on a minute, maybe somebody will do something about this injustice. And little Bron says, and he waits for it, but he feels very disturbed. And as people exit the building, they walk as if nothing remarkable had happened. And he shivers and he shakes. And his governess takes his arm and he says to him, Bron, are you okay? And he says, no, I'm not, miss. He says, what's the deal? He says, they just killed this man and nobody, it doesn't seem to bother anybody. And his governess says these words to him. She says, Bron, don't take it to heart. Someone will think that you are different. This week we called our children to be very different. That we must take things to heart. That we must be different and be alive and sensitive in one's spirit. That you are disturbed when somebody is hurting. That we are concerned when your mom is in hospital and we pray for her because we take it serious. We show emotion and we cry when we feel appreciation for our family and we raise them up before God and ask God to bless them even more. We are different because we listen to what's going on in God's house and we really want to hear and we respond because we feel that there is a relationship between a crisis and a relative response to alleviate the kind of pain and neglect that the person feels at that time. And we are different because we take Christ seriously. The question on the table is this morning, ought we not to be different? Or like the governor says, you know what, you mustn't take these things too seriously. People will think that you are odd. I want to touch on a few things this morning. Is that Paul writes to the church and he says to them, I want you to be different. I want you to be holy. The idea of holiness can be translated in today's term of being different. But if you know very carefully, Paul's text is not written to a church that is having a wonderful day in the sunshine. It's a church under persecution. And he writes to this church and he says, I want you to be different even though you are persecuted. Do not let go of the standards of walking with God. Don't change the fact that when people hurt, lie, steal from you, don't become bitter and twisted. Forgive and smile because you've got an inheritance far greater than what can be stolen or withheld from you. And the idea from Paul is, Peter, he says to them, but as the one who called you is holy, you also are to be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, be holy because I am holy. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 15 to 16. I want you to know that the word called is far deeper than just the idea of being called and said, Kaleo, come here. It is far deeper. There is a greater designation and a greater significance to it. Eugene Peterson, in his book, The Message, writes something a little bit different. He says, we are commanded to live a holy life, energetic and blazing with holiness. The idea of holiness is not the idea of being separate looking down your nose, but the idea of being separated by God, used for a divine purpose, exclusively for his name. And so Eugene Peterson says, we need to look at things more energetic and lively. One of the things that is true today is that you can choose to be married or live single life. But you cannot, as a Christian, not choose to live a holy life. You cannot choose to live a life that is ungodly on the one moment and a person that is holy when your behavior comes under closer scrutiny. The problem is with being different. The problem is with being different because many times when we stand out and we are different, we are afraid that people will see us, They will afraid that we will stand out from the crowd. Let me tell you why that is so. We value conformity. We value to be like everybody else around us. And we're afraid that if we are going to be different, people are going to start asking questions why. And we may have to give an answer, and we're just afraid that I don't know enough to be able to say that this is the reason why I believe that I am different. Not because that I think I am better than you, but because I live a different life because of my Redeemer. I don't know if you remember the days of Greece. Do you remember John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John? Gorgeous people. Amazing people, and it was about a couple called Danny and Sandy. Remember the days when John Travolta used to have his little black deal on? What are those jackets called again? Sorry? Bomber. I almost called it something else. A bomber jacket. He had a bomber jacket on. And what was the shoes now again? I think. Anyway. But I'll never forget how John Travolta walked. He had a kind of a thing. He had one of these vibes. And John Travolta would walk around, his hair was slicked back with a bit of oil and so on. And I'll never forget, I can't remember, I think it was about standard 8. And there, I came from Namibia, I spent most of my holidays there. So thank God I wasn't influenced by this rubbish. But anyway, I came back and I walked in there and a few of my mates started wearing bomber jackets. Some of them had their hair slicked back and some of them in fact walked like John Travolta. You know, I was trying to figure out maybe these cats had hip dysplasia, but I discovered eventually that what actually happened was because of Greece. Because that's the way John Travolta walked. And suddenly you felt a bit odd, and I was part of the odd group. We never smoked at the back. Really, I never smoked at high school. I played athletics. I had a wonderful group of friends, and all of us are still friends to this day. But the point being is that we are coerced by the climate of the day to be a part of this kind of thing. Many of the chicks ladies in our class started having their hair like Olivia Newton-John. And in fact, one of them said, "You can call me Sandy. But your name is Yvette." That kind of thing. So we want to be with the in thing. And like Bron, the governors would have said to her, "You know what? You mustn't just be different. You must be the same as just everybody else, because Greece is the word." The second thing is we visualize caricatures of holiness. And so we find that people that claim to be holy, they're a bit strange. They're not lekker in the head, and sometimes they're a bit touched. Why? Because they live a life that is different. And in fact, we call them people that you think you are holier than thou, because they don't participate in the things that they do. And so we disdain spirituality and behavior that is diametrically opposed to what this world calls from us. But that is exactly what Paul is saying. In the third place, we misunderstand what is called and what is meant by holiness. Let me say this to you, is that we cannot help, but we find that the media has a lot to do with shaping our view of what holiness is. And so we see a monk and a priest, and if I cannot wear one of those long robes, I'm just not one of the holy folk. And we find people that let go of all this material world a little bit strange and sometimes irresponsible, because they don't live in the real world kind of thing. And so all this imagery conjures up for us that being different is a bit funky. But in the text that we find, Peter says to us, I want you to grasp what it is to be different. And that is what we are trying to do with our children. We want them to live a very different life, because like everything comes and goes, so did Greece is the word, and so did all those wonderful people that we might have walked a little bit funky at that time. No, we don't do that anymore, and that's gone, you see. But Peter would say to us, there are some things that are just incredible. But he wants us to get the urgency of the moment. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 13. Peter says, prepare your minds for action. Be self-controlled. Set your hope fully on the grace to be given you when Jesus Christ is revealed. Now, the English translation just doesn't do justice what the Greek translation, written in its original language, because the original language will say to you, be urgent about these things. Come on, get on. Let's go. Let's be urgent about it. Roll up your sleeves. And let's get on with it and live a life of holiness. We all know that our subconscious minds are influenced by our environment and what we take in. I think the computer name is called GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. And so Peter will tell us, I want you to focus on the first thing that makes you definitively different. And that is that we think differently. In the first place, we think differently. And so Peter would say to us, we are urgent about those things that lead to holiness. And Paul warns us when he says, do not conform to this world. And like I didn't conform to the instruction I got from Tish. No. In the same way, we say no to those things that are, and hers was selfless. The world is selfish. Feed yourself. Take care of yourself. Forget about the other guy. And we say we are different. Proverbs 23 verse 7 says, for as he thinks within himself, so he is. The second place, what holiness actually means, is we not only think differently, but we also live differently. Verse 17, Peter says to us, since you call on a Father who judges each man's work impartially, live your lives as strangers here in reverent fear. And the idea here is that we're encouraging our children to live a definitively and distinctively different life in this world. And yes, to be strange in that way, that we look at things differently. There was a wonderful story I read a few years ago about Henri Thoreau. I don't know if you've ever read any of his books. And there was a story about this man. He was an individualist in New England many years ago. And he was sent to jail for not paying his tax. And he went to that supported slavery. He said, I will never do that. And they sent him to jail for that. And during the period in jail, he wrote a book called Civil Disobedience. And that still today is one of the most classic documents that you can read. But a friend of his called Ralph Waldo Emerson came to visit him in jail. And as he looked through the bars at Henri Thoreau, he asked him this question, why, Henry, what are you doing in there? And Thoreau was an extremely sharp-witted man, and he retorted and he says, nay, Ralph, the question is, what are you doing out there? What are you doing out there? When we should be in here telling folk what you're doing is wrong. It's morally reprehensible. And this is where I take my stand. It's interesting that little Bron was said, don't be different. Thoreau was in jail, and everybody was outside. Thoreau was not a churchman, but I encourage you to read one of his books called Walden. He was not a man of God or a churchman, but he made a decision that he was going to live at Walden Pond, live a simple life. I've got the book on my iPad. I don't know how to send it to you, but if you want to read it, it's an incredibly enlightening book. And one of the quotes out of his book, he says, I went to the woods because I wished to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discovered that I had not lived. In other words, he says, I simplified my life so that I could reduce it to the bare essentials of what this life is all about. So that one day when I come to the end, I don't look back and say, what a load of rubbish have I engaged in. I want to do that before the time, and exactly that is what Jesus wants us to do. And so when we deal with the hearts of children, we ask them to, out of the beginning, to make that kind of delineation of what is eternal and that which is transient, and make the choices and throw in your weight with that which is of eternal value through Jesus Christ. Incredibly well done by our teachers, watched and observed, humbled by the tremendous amount of dedication that went into this. Another one of his quotes, he said, if a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step out to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. In other words, what Peter was saying is, you and I march to a different drummer. No, We're not coerced. We're not threatened. We don't find ourselves intimidated by this world, because we find that our Lord Jesus Christ showed us the way to life, and we walk a definitive walk that is different to what this world has. Any woman and man and child can accomplish things differently, because the drumbeat of Jesus is clear within their heart and in their psyche. The third one is, we are different because we love differently. We love differently, and we show a display of love and affection that is pure. That is pure, that is unselfish. We don't give love because we want love back. We give love because we are loved by a Christ that died on the cross. We give love because He has given us so much, and it is a small matter to give out of what God has given us, because it belongs to Him in entirety. It is a small matter to have very little for ourselves, because the same God has said to us, I will provide for you. And it's in that trust that we love sincerely, we are genuine, we are authentic, we have a deep love that is fervent, a deep love shaped through the blood of Christ. Pure love, not wanting to coerce people or gain their favor to use them later. It's not true. We love because Christ loved us from a pure heart. It is ironic that within the God's scriptures, Jesus would say to us, the definitiveness of being a disciple of Him was to be the kind of person that loves. And that is why Jesus would say, being a child of Him, it's not a child of God. These things aren't optional. And He would say to us, I want you to know that a new command I give you, that you love one another. For by this will all men know that you are my disciples. They won't even begin to examine our belief system until we can demonstrate our belief system by the way that we love and care for people. It's ironic, and I was reading a document this morning. You're welcome to a copy. I'll photocopy it to you. During the time of Rome, AD 111 and 112, one of the Roman officers called Pliny was charged by Emperor Trajan to investigate Christians. And the interesting thing about all of this was that he went there under instruction from Emperor Trajan. Trajan was a vicious man. You don't toy with him. You do what he tells you. And it's very interesting to read the letters between these men. And this was during the persecution of Christians. But one of the things that they remark about our family way back then was the following. They said, behold how they love one another. And that was interesting and profound to read. And in fact, you can watch the nuances of those letters between, and thankfully they have been translated from Latin into English, so we can see that inside of there, even Emperor Trajan eventually says, let them go, because they pose no harm to this world. The fourth one that makes us a definitively different people is that we talk differently. We speak differently, we think differently, we live differently, and we look at loving differently, and we talk differently. The words we use reveal our reverence for the God that loves us. We speak words of encouragement rather than words of condemnation. We speak words of upliftment and empowerment rather than words that make people feel less than they should be. I'm going to close with a story. It was a story of a man that went to the YMCA many years ago to pick up his son from swimming. And this has to do with the words that we utter in this world that we live. And while he waited on his son to change his clothing, he wandered around the deep end of the pool to watch a young boy do his dives off the high diving board. The child was between 12 and 13 years old. Oblivious to the other swimmers around him, he shot off the board with his body folded into a flat V, his feet lifted up to meet his outstretched hands. He opened again at the top of the dive, his head coming backward, his arms opening out and away to break the surface of the water, his body knifing straight in with a small splash. The observer figured that this child has been taking lessons. And the boy went up 3 or 4 times and executed the specific move perfectly. And he had only but admiration for this young man. And as the boy climbed out for the 5th dive, his father came out of the locker room. And the boy grabbed his man's hand and towed him to the board and he says, I can do it, Dad, I can do it. That dive we saw on the Olympics replay, I can finally do it. Let me show you. And his father looked at him and says, no, you can't. His dad says, and let go of the child's hand, you can't do it, can you? And then the man observing saw this, that the slight drop of the child's shoulders, the shortened step that made him lose his balance, the sudden change around his eyes as his intensity and confidence faltered for the first time. He climbed the board, walked to the middle, looked at his dad as if waiting or hoping for something, but the man did nothing. Right from the start, the dive was different. The strides were shorter and less sure of themselves. They missed the previous spot by at least a foot, and so the kid did not get the same leverage as before. Without the springboard's power, he could not gain the needed height. He was forced to bend his knees in the V, but even then he had no time to open again and crashed clumsily into the water. And as the boy climbed out of his father's feet, the dad says, I knew you couldn't do that dive yet, my boy. But if you work at it, you might get it someday. Patted the boy's shoulder and said, you want to try again? The boy shook his head and walked away to the locker room while his father stayed outside. I want to say this to you today, that our children are in desperate need to be different. But they need us to parent differently. They need us to parent definitively. And to coin a phrase by our brother Peter, it's to be holy other people that marches to a different drum. And yes, we are not like the world.